In today's video, I'm going to talk about these waterproof fountain pen inks from the perspective of an artist that uses them to draw. This is Document Brown and this is Dark Red, both made by Atramentis. I've already spoken about black and gray waterproof inks in other videos and how great they are to use in combination with ink wash or watercolor. Black is, of course, a fantastic choice to use for your initial line drawings. It provides great contrast and it works well with any color you put on top. This is why it's just about the most popular choice for urban sketchers or anyone else that combines pen and ink with watercolors. Why then would you use a color other than black to do your initial drawing? Well, there's some benefits to it, depending on the subject matter and the look you're going for. First, let me show you the color of the inks with some color samples and swatches. Then I'll show you a few demos where I employ these two inks and talk about why they're so useful. Here's a little swatch of this brown ink along with a drawing that I did with it to see what it looks like in practice. You can see that this color is very similar to walnut ink, which is a traditional material used in fine art made from walnut shells. It's a little bit darker than burnt umber, and in watercolor its closest equivalent is probably Van Dyke brown or sepia. Using this ink will definitely give your drawing an antique feel since this color is so closely associated with old master pen and ink drawings. In fountain pen terminology, this is an ink with a high degree of what's called shading, which means that the color is very transparent and can be lighter or darker depending on the amount of ink you put down. This is something I really appreciate in inks because it allows you to vary the value of the lines, particularly if you're using a fountain pen with a flexible nib. So, for example, pressing down with a flex nib will not only make the line wider, but also darker. So, under regular pressure, you can see that the lines are a lighter brown, and then as I press down, because more ink goes down on the paper, the value is also darker. You can also change the value depending on the speed of the stroke. So if I speed up the stroke, less ink goes down on the paper and makes the value more light. And then if I slow down the stroke a little bit, it actually makes the value of the stroke a little bit darker. Just one added degree of control that you can have when you're using a shaded ink or an ink with a high degree of shading. I put this ink down on very wet absorbent paper to see if it contained multiple coloring agents that might separate out in washes. And as you can see, the color is uniform and doesn't split into multiple colors as some fountain pen inks do, such as, for example, this Noodler's Brown, with this little yellowish orange halo indicating that we have multiple coloring agents here which can split in washes. So, in this case, there's no separation, which means we're dealing with a single pigment here, which is good because it means that the color of this Atramentis brown will stay the same when using it to make washes. Now, one important thing to point out is that this ink is waterproof, but not bulletproof. Bulletproof inks react to the cellulose on the paper almost instantly and cannot be washed away. This ink needs to dry in order to be permanent, so you have to make sure it's completely dry before putting washes over it. Though this ink is on the slower side in terms of drying time, once it is dry, its water resistance is absolutely perfect. So here are a few tests to determine the drying time. And you can see that though the dark red is a slightly slower dryer, both inks are completely waterproof in under 3 minutes. Of course, this is highly dependent on the paper you're using, the amount of ink put down, the atmospheric conditions, temperature, humidity, wind, etc. So what's the advantage of using brown ink over black? Well, as I mentioned, it can give your drawing a softer, more antique look, but I think the best way to explain its advantages is for me to actually show you in a drawing. Here's a little excerpt of me doing a few figure studies. Brown ink is very commonly used in figure drawing because its warmth is more appropriate for depicting live flesh. Sometimes black ink can come off as harsh, whereas brown, particularly in the darker shadows, can feel softer and somehow more organic. The real advantage has more to do with value control, however. Creating subtle transitions can be very difficult to do with black ink because it's so dark and so opaque. Using a transparent ink allows you to build up values little by little and to work very lightly on the halftones as well. It's one way to make drawing in pen and ink a little bit easier. Now, of course, if you're looking for a strong graphic effect, then by all means use black. And really, you should be practicing drawing in black since it's an important method of drawing. But again, if you're looking for a softer effect and you want to make the drawing process a little bit easier, this brown ink is definitely worth trying. Where brown ink really shines, however, is in landscape drawing, particularly when the subject is more rural than urban. One of the difficulties with landscape is dealing with large amounts of green grass, green leaves, green bushes, which if you're not carefully distinguishing can make for a monotonous result. There's also the problem of other cool colors, cool blues and grays, which are very common in nature. Using a warm color like brown for your line work gives a touch of warmth to your drawing that contrasts well with all the greens and other cooler colors. This is something that was well understood by the 17th century Dutch masters of landscape, who often painted their landscapes on surfaces prepared with a warm brown imprimatura, which they allowed to peek through the transparent layers of paint, giving their paintings more vibrancy. During the inking process, I tried to anticipate the placement of the watercolor washes, limiting my hatching only to the foreground, where more texture and detail is needed to reinforce the sense of depth. Again, I think having a warm line running through the drawing provides a nice contrast to all the cooler colors I'm putting down on top. Now, applying watercolor over an ink drawing is, I think, much easier than doing a straight watercolor painting. For one thing, I can be looser with the color washes, and it also allows me to mix color in a slightly simpler way. I usually work as most watercolorists do, front to back, but when doing loose sketches such as this, particularly when you're pressed for time, my process becomes a little bit more scattered. I tend to put down a wash and then move on to something else while that wash dries. That way I'm constantly moving around and not waiting for washes to dry, which slows down the process tremendously. You really don't have to be quite so systematic when sketching, I've found. When putting watercolor over pen and ink, I think the most important thing to do is to keep in mind that no wash goes any darker than the pen. And since we're dealing with a brown, that means your color needs to be a little bit lighter than you would had you been working with black. You definitely want the hatching to show clearly and allow the dark brown lines to emphasize detail and texture. Also, because you have a warm color contrasting with all the cool greens you're putting down, you don't have to be quite so careful to make sure there are enough complementary warm colors in your painting to keep things interesting. Now, since this is an ink review, I'm not going to go into the intricacies of watercolor painting here. That's probably going to require a whole other series of videos. This is just to show you how using brown ink can add warmth to your ink and watercolor sketches and give them a slightly more antique-y look. Okay, now that we've seen a few different ways to use brown ink, let's take a look at the dark red ink. In my personal opinion, it's a really interesting choice, particularly for figure drawing, particularly in combination with watercolor. The thing that initially attracted me to this color is that, though it's not traditional for ink drawing, it closely approximates some tints of red chalk that were often used in figure drawing during the Renaissance. Furthermore, this dark red is quite close to a color one sees in darker shadows of the human form. You can often see this color employed in the frescoes of Pompeii. These masterful painters understood that there should be color in the shadows, and instead of making them very dark or gray, they filled them with this beautiful luminous purplish red. I've already inked this drawing since my channel already has plenty of tutorials on inking. Plus, full disclosure, inking on camera is super difficult, since I find that I have to lean into ink as well as to often rotate my paper. This color is dark enough so you can create a finished drawing with it, but in this case, I've inked this drawing knowing that I'm going to go over it with watercolor. This is why I decided to leave certain areas of reflected light alone and only applied areas of hatching to the darker shadows. I also used very little hatching in the light, anticipating that most of the halftones, those soft transitions in the lighter part of the form, will be completed in the watercolor stage. As with the landscape sketch, the main thing is not to allow the washes to go darker than the hatching. But the good thing is that this dark red goes pretty dark, so I can still get quite a bit of contrast here. Also, as with the landscape, keep the color mixtures fairly simple. In fact, as you can see, mostly I'm going to work with three colors: yellow ochre, Venetian red, and ultramarine blue. By the way, if you found this ink review useful, please subscribe to my channel. I'll do my best to keep these videos coming, but seeing my audience grow is definitely a motivating factor. If you'd like a complete tutorial on using pen and ink in combination with watercolor to draw the figure, I'll leave the link to it below. This is a lovely way to draw in itself, but also good practice for those of you that eventually want to use a similar technique for illustration or graphic novels. I really think that this color complements watercolor very well, and I plan on using it more. Also, if you're interested in the pens I'm using, I'll leave a link to tutorials for those below. The green pen used for the brown ink is a new acquisition that I'm very happy with. It's an Opus 88 Picnic paired with a number 5 14-karat gold Yoho nib from FP Nibs with a semi-flex customization. The one I used for the red ink is the absolutely superb Pilot 743 FA. Having a great flex nib is not a requirement, of course, but there are cheaper, perfectly functional alternatives to the pens I'm using here, and I really think that this ink is best served by a pen with a flexible nib. I hope you enjoyed my review of these two inks from an artist's perspective. One of the great pleasures of using fountain pens, besides the fountain pens themselves, is the absolutely huge variety of ink available, and I'll be doing more ink reviews as I explore and make new discoveries. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below, and I'll do my absolute best to respond.